Thank you very much for joining me on the Voice of Job Seekers. This is the live edition. Well, it's the video edition anyway. We tried to do it live, but that's not going to be for another couple of weeks down the line. So I'm here with my friend Lisa Rangel. She was on a podcast about 5 years ago, I believe it was. And
Wow.
yes,
Is that long ago?
right. So what we're doing is I'm doing a summer series and where I'm going to be interviewing more career experts and to dig down because I think we're in special times. And I think people need to be apprised as much as they possibly can. If you don't know Lisa, I've known her for 5 years. She's been my friend since. She checks on me almost consistently. And it's really great to have somebody always in your corner, and I try to be in hers as much as I possibly can.
You do.
Managing partner of Chameleon Resumes. Her blog is a top 100 Forbes career advice blog. She's a 10-time certified professional resume writer. Might be more since we never ever mentioned credentials when we talk, so it might be more, but we can safely say at least 10. And 13-year recruiter, job expert. Of course, welcome to the show, Lisa. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
It's the honors are definitely all mine. We're talking about job interviewing since most people are interviewing, or I'm seeing an increase in interviewing, at least at the minimum, except interviewing is real slow. I don't know if you noticed that, Lisa, or not, or if you've come across that, but interviewing just seems to be taking a lot longer, and I understand why, but I'm seeing that the interview process is going through, or companies are setting up a few more hurdles than they usually have.
Yeah, I'm seeing it all over the map. You know, I've seen a client literally go on a 14th interview for a position and to get an offer. And I've seen, and it took, at least a couple of months. And I've seen, hires happening in as quick as 3 or 4 interviews over, 10 days. So I think it depends on the level of urgency. I think, is it more of a backfill that's urgent versus, a forward thinking, not needed, but they can capitalize on an opportunity type of hire that might take more time and thought, because it's not urgent, even though it's future focused. So I think it just varies. It also depends on the job description, right? If it's like more purple squirrelish, it's going to take longer to hire and find. And if it's, has more realistic requirements and that person exists in the marketplace somewhat readily, it'll be faster to hire. So I've seen it all over the map. We've definitely seen a good number of people getting hired, but, obviously the year is going to be a net number of layoffs being greater than hires, but hires aren't zero. And I think that's really the message of hope, is that hires are not zero. And, you just got to focus on finding one job is kind of like my mantra. You don't need to solve the unemployment problem, the job skills gap. You don't need to solve the world's or the country's problems. You just need to find one job. So.
Right. Yeah. You have one job and finding one job.
That's it.
That's pretty much the end of it. I think there are people, and I've heard from different sides over the past 3 months. I've heard from employers talking about candidates, and candidates talking about employers.
Right.
All kinds of feedback I've been getting. People all going out of their way to send me LinkedIn messages, commenting on articles and posts that I put up. Some of them have said that there have been times when there've been, particularly when there's been a remote interview, that people are like static. They're
in their presentation, you mean, or just
there's no dynamic attribute to their to communicate via video,
right?
And also in person, that they come in it's kind of without a personality. And that seems to be something that that needs to kind of, that's something that the job seeker can't control. You talk about having an offensive mindset recently, and I've seen that in your recent newsletter.
Right.
Maybe you can, that will help some people kind of liven up a little bit. And I don't think we're not talking about a party, but we are talking about, making yourself interesting enough to stand out from other candidates.
Yeah, I think, I think sometimes, and this is at all levels, although sometimes we primarily, my company at least works at the executive level, I'd say primarily, but, those executives are first, their college grad kids and their professional level friends and spouses. So, I mean, I find that this is really something, this comment I'm about to make really is, at all levels,
Mm-hmm.
that I think people go into interviews and they subliminally or even consciously wait for somebody to kind of like lead the show,
Right.
and they and they wait, to see what they should be mimicking, or what they should be mirroring back, and in theory those are all good strategies to a certain degree, unless you see it going poorly
Right.
or you see that you're not getting your point across. And so, by no means should you just barrel, over the interviewer and take over, because that's not, that tactic on the other pendulum swing isn't going to work either. But I
Right.
think, if you can demonstrate some elements of curiosity, or, if you're giving an answer, end it with a question that sort of feeds a dialogue or shows interest in the employer or in the person that's interviewing you. And if you start to be what you want to see from an employer, or from that interviewer, your odds are you may get it back. They may not realize that they're not doing it, or not, demonstrating that. So, you also run the risk of it falling flat, right? Let's be honest. Nothing's a magic elixir, but I think you can take an offensive, strategically offensive, politely offensive strategy
Mm-hmm.
in an interview. And another suggestion in a way of like doing this is coming across like you're two business partners in a meeting to see if this is a good match, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to this subservient, model where the interviewer has to give the stamp of approval to the interviewee and you're waiting for that stamp.
Right.
It's very subtle, but it really is a shift if you can kind of go in there as an interested, curious person looking to see if this is a good match. It's a different perspective, even though it's still two people virtually or physically sitting across from each other in chairs. It's just the mindset shift that I think can put people in a better light.
Yeah. Um, to some degree, I think the energy kind of goes both ways.
Absolutely.
But more so, the job seeker doesn't seem to understand, or seem to understand that if the energy isn't coming from the interviewer, that they've got to provide the interviewer or the energy,
At least
uh,
try, right?
or at least try.
Yeah.
And if there's an exchange, then you have a great conversation. Um, if you don't, if that exchange isn't happening, of
Right.
course the weight of it is going to be towards you, because the interviewer already has the job. You're trying to get in, and if you're not thinking of ways of how I can, what I can share, what I can say, or something of that sort could bring more liveliness and more depth to this conversation, then you lose out.
Exactly. And another analogy I'll sometimes use with job seekers is, just sort of envision the interviewer like in your living room, like, what would you do to make someone comfortable if they were a guest in your living room? And now, obviously, you're at their place or video, place, right? But if you can just have like, what would you do to make things easier for that guest, right? And if you take some of those elements into your conversation, even as the person being evaluated, you subliminally send a message that you're easier to work with, or, you meet people where they are, and, like, it just sort of subliminally sends that message. And So it's sometimes worth a shot, right? I mean, if you
Right.
look, an interviewer should be qualified. They should be someone who's good at interviewing, but let's face it, that doesn't happen all the time. You get
A lot.
inexperienced interview, yeah, right? You get inexperienced interviewers, you get poorly trained interviewers, you get interviewers who, are used to interviewing one type of candidate and now they're being thrown into this other type of interview that they maybe aren't sure how to ask and they're trying to posture.
Right.
They have a bad day, right? Everybody's human. So, I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios why the interviewer just may not be on game, but
Mhm.
you got to be able to turn that around or, at least
Absolutely.
try to.
Yeah, I really believe that if job seekers understand that they can actually control the momentum of how
Yeah.
the interview is going to go, then it could be a much more powerful experience for them because you're the one you've got to convince that you're pretty great to work with 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
Um, Whether you're going to be in and out of Zoom meetings or you're going to be right there next to someone in the cubicle or around your group, you've got to be the one that takes that kind of responsibility and take control in that way.
Yeah.
You're not going to take control by saying now it's for me to ask you questions, although there are ways to kind of insert further explanations to give clear points and to be able to make the best of those situations and to get the most depth as you possibly can and give them an idea that, hey, this is who I am.
Right.
And, anything below that is going to be subpar to the interviewer. The other question I think that comes up very frequently still is, and I've seen it on a large and small scales about explaining gaps. And that's a tough one for executives and well, for everybody is to
For
be able
everybody. Yeah.
to it's sometimes you got to sell that your value has not, but if they don't get that from you even with an explanation, uh,
Right.
that could be a tough thing to do. So in your estimation of one or two things that might help people with explaining gaps in their experience.
Yeah, I find, from just having gone through, the downturn of 2001 as a recruiter in New York City and um, the downturn in 2008 and 9 at the tail end of my career as a recruiter in New York City. The one thing that a lot of people have in common now that recruiters are hearing multiple times a day is that whatever situation that is causing that person to be looking for the job is going to be pretty much related to the pandemic. And
Yeah.
frankly, if you if you actually left a job or got laid off or got fired or whatever the case may be in January, February, frankly, you could still kind of latch onto that because clearly your gap is being extended because of what happened with the pandemic.
Hmm.
So, and recruiters are so used to hearing it, they almost just assume it, right?
Yes.
So if there is as warped as this may say, if there's a good news angle to this in job seeking and you have a gap,
Hmm.
I would just say ride that wave a little bit, and so as a result, the pandemic kind of reason is going to level the playing field.
Hmm.
And that's not going to be the source of, evaluation.
Right.
Is the positive word, or source of judgment is the negative word, right? So,
Hmm.
but what will happen now, and I see it happening, and I recall it happening those other two cycles that I've been through, is people want to see how you bounce back
Hmm.
through this, what you've done with your time, how you view it, how resilient you are, how creative you are, how human you are. If maybe you really did have a tough time mentally in April, but you know what, you bounced back, you did some service, you did it, so they need to see that if you go through a tough time with them employed, that you got the resiliency and the moxie and the sort of diplomatic vulnerability to just be
Absolutely.
human. But if nobody needs another negative Nelly around the virtual water cooler. If you're going to blame and complain and not see the possibility amongst the chaos, then no matter how qualified you are, people don't need that. Like they need some good energy, or people who can at least help others digest, their bad days,
Mhm.
and come together as a team to make something happen, right? So I think that if you view the pandemic type of reason as like, now everybody's got that, that's not unique to anybody anymore.
Mhm.
And embrace it, and then own it, and show what you're made of by what you're doing with it, and how you view it, then I think that's what can set you apart from somebody else. And by what you've done with it, I'm not saying you gotta like have set up a nonprofit, 6 weeks ago, like, or
Right.
anything like that. Like, it's nothing crazy, but
Right.
it's really just it's a mindset. Like right now, people are hiring mindsets as much as they're hiring skill sets.
Yeah. And I believe you hit the nail on the head. Um, they're listening for your overall tone. And
Yeah,
as you explained your situation, there's things that people can get without you saying that might work negatively against you, especially when you might say there might be one line where you said, well, if my employer didn't lay me off, I would be, then that's a problem. uh,
right. It's definitely a potential problem. Yeah,
as well as there are other things, but it could be, you have to be cognizant completely and be present completely, because if you're not, it's likely that you're going to say something that will cause a pause. So I think that
because
would
there's always two sides to the story, right? And somewhere
absolutely.
in the middle is the truth. So you have to always be careful how you're phrasing it.
And they're not concerned with the other side that's not there. They're concerned with the side that you're telling. And they're also picturing, okay, what would happen in case of if there's turbulence along the way in our job, and how you're responding, what
How you're
your
going to handle
bandwidth
it
is going to be.
exactly.
Because what you say about the last company is what you're likely to say about the current company. And that they're interested as well as in protecting their brand. And if you're not going to be that, if you're not going to epitomize a brand ambassador, you're not likely to be one. So
Right.
that's an important part. Let's talk a little bit about remote working, but I think almost every job in some kind of way is going to be a remote situation,
Right.
even if an employer doesn't say that they have a remote job. It can be one, as we found out. So
Right.
you're going to have to think about it that way. So what does, in your estimation, what does someone kicking and screaming or not wanting to work remotely say about the worker from an employer's perspective? Because there are
So,
people,
just to make sure I understand, the question is if someone does not want to work remotely, but it's a
if
remote
they
job.
don't want to work remotely because for a variety of reasons.
Right.
Not everybody does, even though there are a
Absolutely.
lot of us who would just jump on the bandwagon right away, but a lot of people don't want
Don't
to.
like it, or
Uh,
they discovered they don't like it. You
right.
know.
And what's even worse is when they start to express it publicly. And of course,
Right.
when you're on social media, everything is basically public. What does that say about, at least from the employer's point of view, what does that say about the candidate, or even?
I think it depends on how they go about it. There's definitely a need for in-person work, right? There's a lot of jobs, and not just, you know, like, the grocery and sanitation, or,
Right.
it's all levels, right? Like all levels, there are frontline in-person jobs that are needed. And
Hmm.
I think if the person's going about it where they're respecting safety, they see the value that they can bring to their client in, maybe putting peace of mind in place because they're actually talking to someone, or versus over the phone. Because there's also customers of certain businesses that prefer to do things in person, or the only way
Hmm.
to do it is in person, right? But I think, as long as the candidate is putting safety first in making their suggestion,
Hmm.
and they can position it in such a way that the company is going to benefit from that,
Right.
then, I don't see it as problematic. I mean, if I think you're ignoring safety guidelines or something to that effect, then that could send up red flags about, other aspects of what the candidate thinks, or what the candidate stands for, or what, how they're maybe not putting customers first or things like that. So because, if you put that type of person on the line and they're not respectful of safety or liability issues or things like that, that could be a company risk. So, I think even an employer that wants people to go back to work, but maybe the employer's not ready, right?
Right.
The employee's not ready, like it also, or the job candidate's not ready. Like that's also it's the same thing, but reverse. Like, they need to be respectful of safety procedures. They need to, make sure that they're putting safety of the employee and the customer first, and, reducing liability, not just from a profit and loss statement standpoint, but from a human, standpoint. So, I think that, as long as they're erring on the side of caution, both either the job candidate seeking the in-person job or the employer wanting in-person candidates or employees, I think that's really got to be the case,
Right. Yeah, I think half of people are thoughtful and half are not as thoughtful.
Yeah.
Uh, in most cases, to be honest, older workers are more likely to be the ones that go quick. It will kick and scream about working from home because they're afraid of the technology challenges. And there are
Right.
a lot of challenges that are involved. And if you're not prepared for it, it could be a harrowing experience. But ultimately, we're
But
talking.
on the flip side, I have to tell you, I've seen a lot of like over 50 workers. I say that as I turned 50 just recently. You know, really embrace this technology,
Sure,
so like,
sure.
and I'm not saying you made a generalization, but in general, I tried to avoid generalizations, which I know sounds like a very like contradictory statement. In general, I avoid generalizations, but I've, I've seen younger people struggle being at home, and in theory, they're supposed to be, completely,
Sure.
adept with all this technology and maneuver in and out of it, and and that yet they're, mentally going nuts being home and want to go out and have a job physically in person. And I've seen, older job seekers and employees just like envelop themselves in this whole at-home thing, and they view it being unsafe working in some of
Right.
the job situations that they're in. So they're just making it work and surprising themselves that they can do it well, not just even do it. So,
Right.
I've seen it in all. I feel like, all of these, stereotypes are kind of being blown a bit because nobody's really following what everybody's expecting. And it's actually kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And not as a generalization, particularly because, like I said, there's 50%. It seems like to be half and half, although
Yeah.
you hear more people vocalize their enthusiasm than you do the ones who are not. They are not as vocal
Yeah.
about it. So,
I think it just comes down to listening to people, right? And just getting their
and
preferences and trying to see what you can make work
sure,
as an employer.
sure, sure. One of the other things that we talked a little bit offline, and I think is becoming a bigger headline, is about how Facebook, Mark
Mhm.
Zuckerberg had announced about cutting salaries if you move
Right.
from San Francisco to Iowa, so to speak.
Right.
So someone who's going to be uh, interviewing and go through the process of a remote job where it might be they may live in Iowa, but the job is in Chicago, which is a larger market, which will make a big difference. Uh, in general, we know that, remotely, remote or not, you should be researching salary and trying to find out what it's like in your region. But
Right.
maybe some advice as to some people who are getting ready to cross that threshold of salary negotiation and just being able to make the case for their salary in their area versus or maybe in the employer's area. Um,
It's funny because the announcement came out, and I remember reading it in I want to say it was a New York Times article. I saw it, and I can't remember which article I saw it written in. But I was like, there's some companies that are doing that already, right? I mean, where
right,
you live, they pay you based on the market rate of where you live. There's other companies that, whether you're in Houston or you're in New York City, if you're a VP of blankety blank, you get paid the same amount, and
Yeah.
maybe the one in Houston's doing a little bit better and they got a bigger house, right? Because it goes further.
Right.
Whereas
Right.
the one in New York looks like they're living in poverty, even though they're not doing so bad, just because
Right.
the dollar goes nowhere. But
Right.
so some of that has been happening to a certain degree, but
Mm-hmm.
in both respects, being done and not being done. But I think what's going to happen, in my opinion, is the people who are at the top of their game, skill-wise, they're going to be able to command whatever they want, wherever they are. Because if, Facebook's not going to give it to them, someone else will. So many of these companies are not going back to being, a brick and mortar office for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's not like Facebook is offering the only remote work where they have that leverage. I mean,
Right.
outside of their brand, which I'm not necessarily discounting, if somebody wants to work for Facebook, Facebook's going to have more leverage.
Right.
But if somebody's looking for a remote programmer job, I mean, honestly, get in line, right? Like, there's a lot of those.
Right.
So if you don't get what you want remotely because you want to live in Iowa from Facebook, based on having the top tier type skill set, you're going to be able to shop around if you're not married to needing to work at Facebook.
Right.
So Facebook's going to have to own that. I think where, if you have like a bottom rung skill set or an average skill set, you're going to have to either up your game or get better at salary negotiations, and, really put the weight of your negotiation on your ROI. What skill set you bring to the table that on an open market, it's not going to matter where you live. It kind of goes back to the law that, changed in certain states that they can't ask you your salary, which obviously is a good thing. But, if recruiters, companies want to find out your salary, they have ways to find out ballparks. They're just going to it's the way they ask questions that aren't illegal, or how you react to certain things, or your knowledge of, the market based on how they interview you. So they're going to get a vibe. They also know what companies pay up above market, below market. So then they're even going in with some predisposed notion of what you may be getting paid. Now add some questions, they get a vibe. So it still comes back to the person, the job seeker, having to get better at negotiating on behalf of themselves. No matter what laws are in place, even if they're favoring the candidate, it will never eliminate the need for the employee or potential employee to negotiate on their behalf. It's just, some of these laws cannot put a job seeker in a bubble that they're not going to have to uncomfortably negotiate.
Right.
They're going to have to negotiate.
Yeah.
So I think it just comes back to that. That's how you own it, regardless of the problem, the change.
Yeah, and there's plenty of resources out there that we don't really even have to mention the pay scales,
Yeah.
.com, Glassdoor, even there are some worldwide surveys that people can get a hold of if they're thinking about another country even. As you said, executives is the market value pretty much. It is as is. But for everybody else who are competing, like program developers, and there's a lot of them, and the competition is quite fierce in some sense. You have to understand your skill level, but a lot of people don't think in terms of ROI. In fact, they come out of their job situations and have to go back later because they know that that's what that's where the competition is
right.
Exactly, are you competing? And people forget that they're competing for a job.
Right. That's a very good point.
They apply and they think that there's going to be some kind of halo effect that will affect them positively, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's that research you'll have to do, but also there's that internal research you'll have to understand, and it's about presentation ultimately.
Right. and marketing yourself and positioning you as somebody who's not a commodity that can, be reduced by a geographic element to the negotiation. You have
Yes.
to be able to show that you're sort of, geographic immune,
Right, right, right. And only talent and your ability to, that you can show more than tell
Right,
is going to make the biggest difference in your job search and how quickly people will respond, or how much they don't need to respond, because the proof is ultimately in the pudding. That's a terrible
right.
at all, but that's the only one I could think of at the moment. Lisa, if people want to get a hold of you and want to know more about you, how can they these days?
I have two websites, chameleonresumes.com, and for entry level and professional level job seekers, joblandingacademy.com. You can reach me on either one. You can also find me on LinkedIn and message me there. Those are usually the easiest ways and to get our free stuff, as well as reaching out to hire us. So it's all good.
Yeah, and I should mention that when people sign up for your newsletter, you provide newsletter practically daily.
We've been doing it daily since August 2016.
Yeah, I was going to say it was about 2016 when I
Yeah.
started. I have all 4 years worth.
Oh my goodness.
I know, right?
I
So
am honored. Thank you.
no, really, they they had served to inform some of my thoughts back in
Oh,
those
good.
days.
Good
Still
to
does,
know. Good
but
to know. Thank you. I'm
sure,
honored.
but fortunately, even I get to talk to you personally, which is better than news.
We check on each other. It's a good thing.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much, Lisa, for joining me on the Voice of Job Seekers video version.
Thank you for having me. It's been an
And
honor. Thank you.
thank the rest of you all. Hopefully, you'll be able to get some value over it. It might be worth going over twice. See you next time. We'll have another video for you in the next week or so.